Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to interview you.
Well, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. So we don't have a formal set. What we work is not to come in here and drill with a series of questions, but rather to start with getting a sense of like, why are you here? What has called you to this championing that you've done on behalf of children and the kind of work that you've done and the organization you've created? Like, how do you come to be here? And then we'll go from there into some of the more specific questions about what RAF is about.
Okay. Well, I majored in elementary education in college and really came to that because I wanted to work with children in a counseling aspect and really had looked at it not school counseling initially. And a very wise professor told me that if I really wanted to work with children and families, I needed to learn a lot about schooling and education and that place where children spend a lot of time many times when they leave home at 5 or 6 and spend a good part of every day there. And that it would be a good way to see kind of the breadth and depth of family life or caregivers and how that really operates with children. So I did that and had a minor in psychology, taught school for a while, and then went back and got the master's in counseling and decided to go into school to do the counseling and started a counseling program in an elementary school where there had not been one. A year after I did that, my first child came along and really changed my career path. My son, who is 31, is cerebral palsied and moderately retarded. He was born at a time that we were just implementing the federal law for special ed and state laws were beginning to be looked at. And I got very involved in that process. And of course, I was very involved in trying to see that he got everything he needed. I had been advised to put him in an institution. I knew he didn't belong in an institution, and we were determined to care for him at home. And we did. And he went through the public schools, and during that first 7 or 8 years, I've spent a lot of time learning how state agencies do and do not work together, how federal agencies do and do not work together. And that really changed what I ended up doing. And after the birth of my second child, who is now 24, I went to work in a governor's office on policy issues and really was hired because they knew I was someone that was determined that agencies were going to learn to do more than share pieces of paper. They were going to always hopefully be pushed to look at children as whole beings, as family units, as units, and not discrete little pieces. And I did that for 10 years and then came to Washington to work in policy. Once my government stint was over, I also knew that I would end up in one of two areas of children's policy and programming, and it would either be children's literacy or it would be children's health. And I feel very strongly about both and really started looking for and spent about 10 months looking at where I wanted to plant myself for a while, and that's how I came to Riff.
Well, that's a fascinating story of the kind of intrinsic motivation that I find in the people that are really making the difference. It's so important to get that grounding, I think.
Right.
Um, so, literacy and health was your sort. Why literacy?
Well, I wasn't finding anything in the health field right then. It's not that so much that literacy won out because I felt this was a stronger program than other places or places that might deal with health. I just wasn't finding anything right then in the health field. And perhaps part of that's because I feel like that despite the fact that we don't do a very good job as a nation ensuring our children health care, we have made some great strides in recent years. And at the moment, if we as a country will properly fund some of the laws that are on the books about some of these state health programs that states can use federal dollars for, we really can make a significant difference there. So in a way, because there are some good mechanisms set up right now, I think that's probably one reason I wasn't finding that much open in the kind of policy that I was looking for in advocacy. I'm not a healthcare provider, but I really want to make sure children who are not guaranteed health care in this country have access to that health care. They are not going to read if they cannot hear or see or have appropriate substitutes or aids instruments to help them in that. And if a child is physically ill, they are not going to learn and they're going to be impeded. But I think we've made some strides there, and now it's a matter of having the will to fund it.
Excellent. So initially you come in with a concern for children, well-being of children, and impassioned by your own experience with your own child, focused on where can you locate yourself so as to help the most amount of children. And that goes into the health and literacy. And health seems to have a lot of advocates and a lot of traction as far as policy and law starting to come in place. And so you move into literacy. What were some of the first things that you started to discover about the needs of children with respect to literacy that helped to formulate your next steps?
Well, actually, I had gotten back into literacy in a big way my last 4 years in government here because I headed the America Reads Challenge. And we worked very hard on a piece of legislation called the Reading Excellence Act that was a small-scale piece of legislation, in a sense, to begin to have states look at teacher education, for one thing. And while it did not have near the dollars that eventually No Child Left Behind put in it, it was very much on that model. It had to do with looking at research-based methods, and again, it was more a pilot project in the states. So the America Reads Challenge was a project that had been put together because we were very concerned about the NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We were very concerned about what do we do to have children better prepared to go into school. And instead of sending out some mandate that every state must start preschool education or every state must do this in reading or that in reading, we decided to start with looking at what was happening in the schools and, above all, better teacher training. So that was one component of the America Reads Challenge. And the title came about because it was the President's challenge to have America read. We also instituted a program under the Federal Work Study Program for Higher Education to allow college students who were doing their work in work study to read with students in early elementary school, X hours per week, to be in the schools or after-school programs or weekend programs reading with children. Now, we were very careful not to talk about teaching of reading in that. And each college set it up in a way that fit their situation best. Some colleges put those students in the College of Education and they used upper-level elementary ed students or graduate students. Other colleges let a student of any major go in, and it was more of a reading buddy situation. But that was one piece of it. We formed a coalition of businesses and associations that were concerned and interested in giving their voice to the premise we had that everybody in the community has a role to play in this. And if that role is nothing more than being very supportive of the local school system or being advocates for early childhood education, but we feel still, even here at RIF, that everyone in the community has a responsibility to see that a child is raised in an environment, and that environment being the full community that is language rich and understands the importance of that child having good solid language development and development in reading skills. So a number of those pieces I had put together in the America Reads Challenge over 4 years to do things throughout the communities in the United States that wanted to get involved in that short period that we were putting that together. So I've brought a number of those things to Reading is Fundamental. Now, we are very, very clear here that we are not the teachers of reading, and we do not try to get into that. RIF was founded 38 years ago by a woman, Margaret McNamara, who was tutoring in the schools here in D.C. And one day she got ready to leave to go to one of her tutoring sessions with 3 little boys, and she thought, they are probably so bored with those same very few books that are available in their school, picture books, not textbooks. So she took some books off her own personal bookshelf that her children had had years before and brought them to the school with her and was letting the children read them, and she saw how excited they were. And so she said to them, you may each choose a book to take home with you today. It is yours. The children got very excited and apparently didn't hear the "it is yours" part. They took it home, but they brought it back the next tutoring session, and she said, oh no, you may keep it. And she had them write their name in it, which is sort of one of our trademarks still when we do book distributions, which is a piece of our program. And she just said it was one of those aha moments that we often have in life. And she realized how much it meant to those children, and the fact that they were, telling her things like they didn't have books at home. And she knew what scarce resources there were in the school classrooms. So she brought a group of people around her kitchen table to form an initial little steering committee, kitchen cabinet, board, that started raising money to do book distributions and story reading, other motivational activities when they would go do these book distributions in the public schools here. And of course, good ideas, even pre-internet, spread fast. And she began to get calls from all over the country, people wanting to know, how could you set up such a thing? What could they do to have a similar program? And eventually she went to the government and got a grant to help so that RIF could expand. And of course now, in our 38th year, we're in all 50 states. We're in what we call 5,000 primary sites, but many of those primary sites have multiple sites or buildings or clubs, activities across the community. So we have over 24,000 individual sites that we work with in the book program. Now, the book program is the core on which we were founded that I just described, and this is a program where children get from 3 to 5 new paperback books per year that are given out in a distribution where the children have choice among titles, and there must always be some kind of motivational activity coupled with it. And, we can say, what is motivation? What we're trying to do there, our mission is really to have children love reading, and we know that if we can motivate them to see that it can be fun, then they'll want to read more. This, for one thing, may help them become more open to the instruction that's available to them, and then we know it's important to practice the skill in order to make it become real, and for you to reach a point where you're not consciously thinking of those skills A, B, C, D, but you're reading very automatic, because that's the only time you're going to comprehend. So we're there to get them excited. And the motivational activity, for me, is probably best described as we're trying to create that magic moment for them that so many of us who love to read really have memories of a favorite person that read to us, and we can remember what they smelled like, what they felt like as we sat by them, how they said certain words, what we most liked for them to read to us. Recently I read an article about a woman that remembers an ugly green plastic couch that her parents always sat on to read with her. And she said, even though when you really look at it, it was an ugly green couch, it's one of the prettiest memories she has, because she remembers sitting there with people she loved and who loved her. And they were creating that bond with reading, because what she really got out of that, besides some very good role modeling that she probably doesn't realize, she got a love of reading. And so we're trying to do that by coupling things that the children may already see as fun or as very positive with the receipt of the book. And this can be anything from the St. Louis Riff. The ladies go in their green aprons on distribution day and they fan out to the classrooms and read stories to the children, and oh, they are great readers. These ladies, they really get into telling the stories and the children love it. We have groups where they go in and put on plays. Rotary clubs may dress in costumes and go out to the schools. They may help the children build floats on little red wagons and have a book parade. All kinds of things. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but that kind of thing is to go on. Now, over those 38 years, we've all learned a lot more about reading and about the teaching of reading and motivating children to read and what's needed. And so RIF has tried to grow with that. And in recent years, we have begun to develop programming that can wrap around that book program or be done independent of the book program. We now have a Train the Trainer program called Care to Read, where we go in and train people to go out and work with child care providers. Because we all know now from the research how very important it is to make certain children are being exposed to certain aspects of language development that will help them be better readers and absorb that teaching when they do enter school. And we're motivated in part there to continue to look at the early childhood by things like Betty Hart and Todd Risley's study. And you know, we're very concerned about that 17,000 word gap they talk about and all that it represents, the sounds, the being read to, the experiences children learn about through that reading. We also are concerned that many children of low-income families are in child care a great deal. Now, we're not concerned about them being in the child care. We're concerned, are all child care providers trained as they should be? And we know that even our Care to Read trainers who go into child care centers won't catch many children who are in in-home care. And so one of the most recent things we've done is develop a kit that has 4 30-minute tapes in it. And those 4 30-minute tapes cover 4 very important aspects of language development for preschool children. And they're very practical in that we went into what we felt were some model in-home child care settings to show what you can do in your home without turning it into a school per se. We also used experts, though, the top experts in the country, we feel, in early childhood, to be able to say to those care providers in a very plain spoken way, why is it important that you read to these children, that you talk to these children, that you give them experiences feeling different textures, that when you're taking a walk outside, you're making sure you point out the things they see and get them to talk to you about what they're seeing. So we tried to give them the basis and not just here's what you ought to do. There's a self-study guide with those 4 tapes. There's a poster that shows things they might do in their home. We then have additional resources on the web that we let them know about, and if they don't have a computer in their home, we encourage them to go to the library and look at some of those resources that help. Those resources help them know how you take a simple picture book and can do so many things with it as a base or a guide. We have a program that's been designed specifically for very young parents, teen parents, shared beginnings, helping them see what their role will be, and also trying to help them become more avid readers themselves. We have a program called Family of Readers. And this is a program that is a 4-session parent training program on what is this stuff called language development in our young children. And this is kind of for ages 5 through 8 children. We're in a lot of Head Starts with this program and help them do their parent component. Part of that particular program, the parents get to actually choose a small library of books to leave in the site that they can check out from there. And one thing we have found with Family of Readers is these parents sitting there together who have come to school not to hear a report on how well or how poorly their children are doing, not to be told a list of 15 things that they have to do at home in order for their child to make the grade, so to speak. But it's more conversational, informational, how to make simple things that you can use in the home. Many sites tell us that after the first year, parents, when asked, are very glad to lead those discussions, and many times by the third or fourth year, the Head Start officials or the school officials or the community of faith officials, they don't have to do anything but show up and unlock the door, and the parents are in there talking away about what they do when they read this book with their child or that book. And we also, in all of these courses, try to help parents who may not be good readers themselves know that there are plenty of things they can do. Very frankly, for many of us, that first year of life, while we still encourage books, if people would just talk to their children during that time, and throughout those early years, do a lot more talking than they do, that's critical. The books are important, and we want a child to be very familiar with them before they enter school, and we also know the books help us make sure that children are getting some of those things like rhyming and different sounds, and they're very important. But we also try to stress the talking, because that's another way parents who cannot read or do not read well or still have that stigma of, I'm a failure at this and I'm not going to pass that along. We also are very interested in making sure that parents who do not speak English or speak limited English know that there are things they can do with their children. And so we, several of our programs like Family of Readers and Shared Beginnings, we can present that program to them in Spanish. Among our publishers in the book program side, we try to make sure we're always looking for good books in other languages or bilingual books. We currently are doing a program with the LA Unified School District, an after-school program that targets predominantly Spanish-speaking parents. And one thing I'm finding among parents who speak another language is that many of them, with all the talk nationwide and the pressures that are there for schools to do better, many of those parents feel that they have nothing to offer their children, that they're going to hurt their children by speaking too much Spanish. And we really try to go in and let them know they have many valuable things to give their children, and that research does show if a child is conversant and understanding of one language, it makes it that much easier to move them to another language. And many of those parents are so relieved to hear that they can still offer something to their children. So that's been very gratifying to us.
Great.
Excellent. I'm going to move this up just a bit.
There's a number of areas you touched on I'd like to go back to now.
Sure.
Open up a little bit. So let's start with, and I think one of the things I'm very interested in is how you language and represent the relationship between developing the kind of verbal dexterity, oral language proficiency in the home, and its connection to reading later and educational success in general through it. But I think that the main question I'd like to have you speak to is, right, is your name. Why is reading fundamental?
Well, many different people use different terms. They say reading is the gateway, it's the foundation, it's the base. The phrase I use a lot when I'm talking to audiences, because they sometimes look at me like, why do they give NAEP at 4th grade, and why do you keep talking about if they don't have it, so to speak, by the 4th grade, that we have significant problems looking us in the face. And it's just that old saying of from birth, really, until third or fourth grade, you're learning to read. You're learning those mechanics of reading. It's not that it stops after that, but you're learning those basic pieces. And once you get into the third grade or a little beyond that, you move from learning to read to reading to learn. And one example I give people when I'm trying to explain that is, not long, maybe a year or so after we started America Reads, we decided to start America Counts as well, to look at what we begin to do as a nation to improve math scores among children. And one of the first things that was done was to fly a lot of top math teachers at all levels, but into Chicago for a weekend to have them take a lot of the different math tests that are given around the country. And with no coaching, it was so funny at the end of the first half day, all they could talk about at lunch was how it had never hit them so full force that you cannot do math if you cannot read. And they said they were going to be better teachers come Monday morning because they at least had a better awareness of that. But when they had to sit there for even just the half day, they realized, and quite frankly, if you can get that realization across in math, it's not a hard one to make in the other subjects. And any elementary school teacher, fourth grade or above, the most common thing you will hear them lamenting in the school teachers lounge or in meetings is, I really think that child could grasp the subject I'm teaching if only he or she could read. And so the name, I believe, and I've never read anything on exactly how they decided on reading as fundamental, but since I still have 3 original board members who are very, very involved in talking to them, it was a recognition that the skill is a fundamental one, but they wanted to highlight that word fun because that's what they were really about, was showing children that it can be fun. It is not just a subject in school or a lesson or a chore.
Great. I mean, it's clear from a cognitive science point of view, with other work that we've done in other areas, that the process of learning to read builds brain infrastructure.
Right.
That's the ground of our ability to be critically self-reflective, analytical, and that as we trace back the history of all of this, civilization became critically analytical, scientific, you start beginning using categorization and abstraction and what have you, in direct relation to its use of this code,
Right.
of this system. And so each child kind of recapitulates that. But up until the time that the child actually begins to engage with print directly, they're living in a more natural oral language environment. And something about how well they grow in that is a necessary prerequisite, how well they can take off in reading. And so you speak to that when you talk about your parent and family work relative to stressing with parents the importance of their verbally engaging with their child, rather than just watching, letting them watch television, or to actually pull them into more meaningful conversation. How do you language that piece of it yourself? Why is that so important?
Well, like you have said, it certainly is one way we now know through science that we're building that infrastructure in the brain and expanding it. Children, the print is not going to come alive if they don't have something to couple with it. And the something that parents can give them are the sounds. And then in school, they can begin to learn how that squiggle on the piece of paper relates to those sounds they've heard. And if they have not heard them very much, they're going to have a great deal of trouble. And unfortunately, the children who, on the whole, hear those sounds the least Are children in low-income families where the parents don't feel confident about their parenting skills, or they feel just very overrun by the pressures of having food on the table and a roof over the head? And I think the most effective thing I've seen done is when we are working with low-income mothers or fathers who do just feel there's not a moment left in the day, or harried professionals even, is to put that daily schedule of when the parent is with the child, what are the activities that are going on? And they'll tell you, well, I can't talk to them while they eat breakfast because I'm busy fixing the lunch sacks. And so then you have to begin to show them that it doesn't always have to be sitting right there on the couch together having a story time, but the fact that if the child is sitting at the table eating breakfast and the parent is at the counter right next to it spreading the peanut butter on the bread, the parent can be describing what they're doing verbally, and the child can be watching it while they eat the breakfast. And that's quite valuable. But for many parents, they have no sense that that would have any meaning. And then we talk about, as you're putting the clothes on the baby, if you do nothing more than verbally describe what you're doing and look at the child with a pleasant face, you're having real impact. It's an easy thing for me to do, in that my son, who is disabled, was not verbalizing on time, so to speak, and I was told there was a very good chance he wouldn't speak over 2 syllables at a time until he was 6, but that the most important thing I could do is talk nonstop to him, and I did. And it's very easy for me to do, but it was a marvelous learning experience, in that when he did start talking, you heard the people that had been with him most those first 5.5 years, their inflections, their phrases, and it literally was, as I carried him, since part of his disability is physical, I was always narrating for him what we were doing. And if I was saying, we're putting the white clothes in the washer now, these are towels, the towel feels different than the pillowcase, and now we're putting the soap, and this soap is called powder, and we're going to feel it, and it's a little rougher than the flour we use in the kitchen. Now, did I think he understood all of that at 2 years old? Of course not. But it was just planting those sounds in him and beginning to talk about concepts. Going from the sound, how it relates to the squiggle, the children are not going to know what is meant by the words they learn to sound out if they don't have an experience with it. You know, children in South Arkansas, where I grew up, have no idea what the word subway is the first time they sound it out, unless they happen to have been to a much bigger city than we have. And I have friends who have taught inner city schools. Children can sound out what a cow, the word cow is. They've never seen a cow. They're not even sure in a picture they know what it is. So the constant talking and describing life experiences to children, telling family stories, or we have cultures in this country who have such a rich storytelling tradition that getting them to share that with the children and describe it gives our children not only the sounds to then begin to put together to be words, but they'll know what that word really is. They'll either have an image in their head, or they'll remember a story that used that. And that's how we begin to build comprehension then.
Excellent. Let's pause for just a second. Well, this is really great. I really appreciate hearing your story and the story of RIF and the work that you're doing. As you know, we have interviewed a number of people to try to shine a light on the degree and dimension of significance associated with this problem. We're taking it from the micro-time movements inside the brain that sort letters into sounds and virtually assemble this virtual reality experience before reading with neuroscientists. And we're traveling back in time to the beginnings of writing and the beginnings of the alphabet and how they're connected to the spread of the alphabet around the world, particularly in Western Europe, to the collision between different oral languages and the Roman alphabet, particularly in England, that resulted in the huge and structure of the English that we deal with today, the kind of challenge that represents to the brain. Our basic perspective is that learning to read is an artificially confusing challenge. Artificially confusing challenge to organic, evolved brains that human beings have. And that the context, for the most part, that this is occurring in is causing the child to feel that the confusion reflects something wrong with them.
Absolutely. And I see it in children all the time. I did when I taught 6th grade. And there were young people there that I knew I might as well admit to myself deep down that it was going to take years, and would it ever happen, that they would rid themselves of the sense of failure they had because they could not read. And I felt so helpless. And for the longest wouldn't tell people where I graduated from college because I assumed the college of education I graduated from was the only one that made teachers feel that we didn't know how to teach reading. It was pretty interesting when I started visiting with people across the country. I was finding hardly a teacher that felt like they had been taught what they needed to know to work with young people with reading. So I no longer feel ashamed of my school. It wasn't their fault alone.
Yeah, that's why it's a collective social educational challenge.
Right.
We frame what this learning to read challenge is, because when you look at the obstacles, in addition to the degree of oral language proficiency that's necessary to have the brain processing and vocabulary background to take off in this confusion. You've got the confusion of the code itself and the high speed with which it must be processed. But enveloping both, you've got how does the child feel about themselves in it. Right. And once they have too much repeated confusion, frustration, that they feel, they come to feel as their own fault, they want to avoid doing it.
Right.
I'm sure you have some experiences of the power of shame in relation to the avoidance. Yeah? Anything come to mind to share there?
Not really. I think the experiences I had more there were really when I was teaching school, and that's been a long time ago. But there were children that you could begin to see how they had developed real coping mechanisms to avoid situations where they would not have to show that embarrassment. It's amazing the closer you got to a certain young man in my 6th grade class, the closer he thought it was to his turn maybe to have to read something. That's when his hand would go up and he needed to go use the restroom, please and thank you. So things like that just became a very natural part of that child's life. And I remember that young man asking me about 6 months into the school year once why I didn't make kids read out loud in the classroom. And I realized what he was saying to me was, you haven't done it for 6 months. Are you all of a sudden going to start doing it tomorrow? So do I have to stay tense, or is this for real? Can I really relax? And I told him I didn't believe in calling on children to read who did not want to, and that I didn't, that we were going to keep it comfortable, and that people had very different reasons for not wanting to read, and that sometimes it was just they didn't like doing it in front of other people or a large group. They might do it in front of a friend, and there were others who maybe had trouble with that particular textbook, but could perhaps read another one. So, I did see his whole body relax. I think he still stayed on alert, afraid I might forget someday what he thought was the best wisdom he had heard. But he was more relaxed about everything. And that young man had a terrific mind for science activity. And so at one point when we decided to put eggs in an incubator in the classroom, because I'd never seen an egg hatch, and I grew up in a rural area, but we didn't have chickens in my home that was in the, quote, city of 2000. And this young man was absolutely terrific at kind of sitting and giving the kids a narration of what was probably going on. And he met me every weekend at the school at the times of day when we had to turn the eggs. And he not only enjoyed doing it, he knew why we were doing it, and he could describe it beautifully. But if he had had to write the report or even read another student report, he really couldn't do it. And when I went to graduate school, of course, when they were first beginning to talk about some of the reading disabilities, the learning disabilities in a formal way, of course I saw that child reflected right there. But we didn't know a lot about that in a formal way, and we had not learned the strategies to use with them to the extent we could today.
It's amazing. The closer we get to this, the more that it looks like it, overwhelmed with this artificial confusion and feeling at fault for it. Children are developing a pre-conscious aversion to that confusion, which decapitates learning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, in that sense, the learning to read challenge is the nation's greatest learning disability, or the greatest learning disabling thing that children are at risk for.
Right. I agree with you.
Yeah, that's one of the things we're trying to really get understood.
Well, and it's one of the things that we're there to do, and one of the reasons that we continually look at the younger years, although in our book program itself, we're authorized to serve through 18-year-olds, and we do to some extent, but increasingly looking at the younger ones and trying to keep some excitement and inquisitiveness there and help that child see that a book can be something more than a dreaded lesson, if it is that for them.
Right. I mean, it seems like you're creating... I had a conversation with Stephen Krasham the other day. He's very big on library advocacy, saying that in his view, the ultimate problem with reading is there isn't enough books. So, without necessarily, subscribing, completely with that, I can certainly appreciate that. I mean, part of the equation here is that children have to have the interest. They
Right.
have to be interested. I mean, as we're learning at the cognitive science level, what cognition's doing is inside the field of what's interesting. I mean, we don't really engage and learn to process well things that don't get our attention, that we're not
Right.
interested in.
And that's why we talk a lot about choice. We want children to be able to choose. It's just like adults in an organization. It's very hard to be enthused about carrying out the goals for the year or for multi-year or the mission of an organization if you didn't help create it. I mean, we are going to work much harder toward those things that we were invested in helping to develop. And so children need that choice. I mean, I don't really care if I ever read anything about snakes. I'm just, I wasn't traumatized. In fact, as a child, they didn't bother me at all. But I'm just not interested in snakes. But if a child is wildly interested in snakes, then I want them to have books there that they can feed that interest. And, it may not be snakes. If a child is right now more interested in having a chapter book despite the topic or in spite of the topic, if they want chapter books, I want them to have a chapter book there. And if they're a very young reader, we need to make sure Frog and Toad is right there because it's written like a chapter book. So there are all kinds of different things that interest the child, and those interests change, and people have multiple interests. And so they do need this variety there. And RIF is a big supporter of libraries. We know that on our book program side, 3 to 5 books a year starts to build a little library for a child, but it's not enough. That this book is my own is an important thing. And for many children we serve, there is no other print in the home. There may not even be a phone book in the home. There sure probably is not a newspaper or a magazine that a parent is reading. And so the books are very important, and books for ownership. But at the same time, I think it is part of our responsibility, as it is the responsibility of the school and others that come in contact with the child, to make sure they know how to use the library, because it's almost limitless in a sense.
Right. That's excellent. Yeah, I can see the incredible benefit of, it's really clear that we've got to help children develop these automatic, unconscious code processing skills, but that somehow we have to build a system of instruction that allows those things to build inside the field of the child's interest at the content level of what they're reading. And this is the tricky business. And without having a choice, which ultimately what's interesting is what's personal. You can't generalize that. You can't say all kids. I remember my daughter once being given an early reader on baseball. She didn't have any interest in baseball. So it's very much the point on the snakes.
Right.
We've been working with some young adults that are struggling at Goodwill, and they wanted to understand prison breaks, and that was a kind of a bizarre topic. We'd prefer not to have engaged in it, but that's what they want to read. That's what's juicing them. Then we
That's
don't
right.
We want to leverage their interest in building the stairway through which they can learn to read.
Well, and the other thing that's so important about the early childhood piece is the more children are talked to about what's going on around them, and the more experiences they're exposed to, it really increases the base from which those interests are drawn. And there may be a day in my life I am interested in learning something about snakes, but it's not at the moment. But the fact that I was fortunate to have parents and grandparents that really tried to expose me to so many different things and experiences, and to learn about different people, then I'm not fearful of, picking up something and looking at something a little differently than maybe I would have before, because I was exposed to so many different things as a child. And that's what you're doing for your daughter now, taking her to meet these different people and see different places. So that's another piece of this early childhood thing, I think, is just building that storehouse of experiences that you may not draw on some of them for a long, long time, but they're there.
Wow, you've done a great job of covering your personal background, the reason for being of RIF, and its major activities in the world. Is there something we haven't touched on relative to something that you consider as hot in all of this field? That you
Yes.
Please, good. Go.
The summer slide.
The summer slide, okay.
As a teacher, another thing you hear a lot about in teachers' lounges is everybody knew children were losing ground, and particularly the lower performing children. And I got so excited when I found Carl Alexander and Doris Entwistle's work from Johns Hopkins University, and could really begin to study that. And when I finally tracked them down as people, I learned that there had been a Center for Summer Learning started at Johns Hopkins, and we here at RIF have been doing work with them on this whole issue. I mean, people for years have had special summer reading programs. I've always felt like the children that took most advantage of them were the children probably that were going to read anyway. But it's great that we heighten it and make it more fun. But I'm really concerned about those children that would not have parents that would support getting them to a library where there's a summer reading program or something going on. We also know from research that's been done on summer programs that it's not a matter of just having more school or a setting like a school. It's really giving these children, it's back to my point of building a base of experiences, and that the best summer program is one that both concentrates for periods of time on the actual instruction, but then gives children experiences to build on. And it's exactly what my parents did for me. I mean, they didn't have to have an intense period of instruction, but I read all the time. One of the only things to do in a town of 2,000 in the summer was walk back and forth to the library until late elementary school when we got the first swimming pool in town. But besides that reading, my parents were making sure I had lots of other wonderful experiences. Girl Scout camp, my grandparents were taking me, on trips. My mother would, and other mothers would get groups of us together to do craft activities, or to go out to the farm where we didn't live and pick corn and see what that was like to pick it fresh from that stalk and not just open the tin can from the grocery store. So the Center for Summer Learning at Johns Hopkins, I believe, is a wonderful resource for this nation, because what those studies that Alexander and Entwistle have done and others have added to now, they've really been able to show that children in elementary school, their work is in Baltimore, but that children, regardless of reading level, were learning at about the same rate throughout the year. And so even if one group started at 1 percentile and another one several lower, the gap, if you just look at the school year, the gap didn't widen. But why was it by the end of 4th or 5th grade that gap was wider than when they started in kindergarten or 1st grade? And when they then look at where children were at the end of the school year and where the same children are individually at the beginning of the next school year, it's amazing how that cumulative loss those children have explains the gap almost precisely. And I think if we're going to continue to push to, narrow that gap, we really must think about this issue of summer. And I always hasten to add to audiences, as I will here, I want people to remember what I said earlier. This is not a call for or against year-round schooling, because the research has shown we can do typical summer activity and not have it be school that will help these children do a better job of lessening that gap that we begin to see. So I feel very strongly about the summer reading part and how we design programs to work with those children.
Good. We will follow up on this and drill into that a little deeper. I appreciate you.
I would be glad, when we leave, I'll be glad to print out the name of the executive director, a young man at the Center for Summer Learning, and he would be able to show you to the researchers. He is a former Boys and Girls Club of America National Director of Education, and he came to this job about 2 years ago.
Good, I appreciate that.
And they have a graduate student of Carl Alexander's a number of years ago at Johns Hopkins really became very, very interested in all of this. And as a graduate student, he and a fellow graduate student started a summer program in Baltimore that is in its 12th year. It's an interesting program in that it also is a teacher recruitment program, and they take students in their junior and senior years of college who most of them aren't even in education. Many of them switch to education afterwards, but they couple with the Baltimore schools. They have mentor teachers in each of the classrooms with these college students that have gone through 3 weeks of intensive training to use the specific reading and math programs they use in the classroom. And they do this with the youngest elementary students. They're trying to catch them right before and after kindergarten and 1st grade. And the morning is very intensive instruction, and then there are activities in the afternoon. And at least once a week, families are invited to be part of the activities. So he'll be able to tell you some exciting data there as well.
One of the things that you mentioned that I think is always important to bring up in contrast with the modern situation for children was, in your growing up, the relative number of options you have to entertain yourself were radically more limited than even children of poverty today with respect to the television and movies and video games and all the stuff that's surrounding them that doesn't require them to read in order to get some kind of flow experience of enjoying some rich other world than their personal existence. This makes it all the more difficult when it comes to the motivational factors. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's another reason that, after school programming is often looked at as just babysitting for safety kind of thing. And good after-school programs can certainly begin to whet that appetite for showing how reading can be part of it. I mean, if a child is wild about a particular video game, and I can't even give you an example, I don't know any of them, but we can build on that. We don't have to put it aside. We can take that interest And if the interest is the technology of it, we can build on that piece of it. Or is it the subject of the game? Or is it the competition of the game? So how do we take what it is that most interests that child in that particular game and build on it in reading? And there are plenty of ways to do that.
That's excellent. I totally agree. I think that's so important. That requires a different kind of assessment to understand, interest levels, and then a vast library that you can
Right.
call upon to create the stairway that's going to fit.
But we turn so many children off because we tell them, okay, you can play the game for 10 minutes and then it has to go away.
Yeah.
Well, if I love chocolate milkshakes and I can only drink 2 sips and then it goes away, I'm not going to pay any attention to what you make me do next. I want the rest of that milkshake.
Some of my earliest work was based on observing children playing Nintendo games. At one time, there were more Nintendo machines than there were personal computers. And it wasn't that the adults were playing, or even the teenagers. It was the 4-year-olds, 8-year-olds who were playing. They wanted it so much they pulled it right through the world.
Right.
To have this kind of engagement that they're so hungry for. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of understanding what they're capable of doing. One other question that I have, and then again I ask you, is there something else that you think is important? So I was saying before, relative to the shame piece, right, is that once children develop this aversion to the feeling the shame that they've learned to associate with the confusion, the frustrating confusion of this process, they're avoiding it. And so clearly the ultimate best solution to that is success. But in order to get enough attention to get success, we've got to deal with that shame. We've got to deal with that affect. We've got to find ways to reframe the context of this reading experience so they're not so quick to go into self-blame because it's difficult. Do you know anybody who's working that edge really well?
No.
Okay.
Unfortunately, no. I mean, I'm sure I've observed people that I felt were doing a great job with a particular child, but even they say that it is so individual intensive and that they don't even know how to go in a classroom and say to future teachers or to counselors. I used a lot of bibliotherapy when I was doing counseling with children. But again, it was so individual to the child. And it might start out with simply working with a poem that was 4 lines long, depending on that child's, interest. But I think it's more psychology initially than knowing specific literacy tools there to use. And we don't give that to teachers. And I can just hear people right now who are talking so much in legislative bodies and school boards about getting teachers better trained in the subjects they're going to teach. I hope we're not going to forget that we need to teach them something about the human being they're going to be working with, because that subject matter is going to be of no use to them if they don't know better how to read a child and how to begin to cope with it. And I just think of children I worked with, through the years. Sometimes the signals were very strange in relation to what that child was really asking for. And I'm not saying we all have to be PhD psychologists, but it takes more than a developmental psychology course for a teacher to really get them to where they can read that we are not just dealing with a naturally shy child, whatever that means, that this is a child pulling away. Are they pulling away because there's been a catastrophic event in the life at home? Are they pulling away because they've been abused? Are they pulling away because of the shame that they feel that they have not been successful before? And we have to free teachers to be able to say to someone, I don't know what to do. But they feel like they've got to show that they know what to do every moment. We've put that on them.
So that they don't feel shame.
That's right. Everybody's
getting
right. And we just aren't doing a very good job of putting that kind of training in. But, what can we expect from a system that says, you can take a very few number of hours in education courses, and you're qualified to walk into a room of 20 children that you've never met before. You may have a cumulative record on them. Records may not be very good. You certainly know nothing about their home life or the life they've had up until now. And you are going to take those 20 lives, and by yourself as a brand new teacher, and maybe you haven't been around children since you were a child yourself. If we wrote that up the way we do it, people would tell us we're crazy. And I'm so pleased with programs like I visited in Santa Cruz, where they have a teacher induction center, but it's not just for first-year teachers. They're really doing things, it was considered quite innovative that they figured out have music and art for children during a period across, bring classes together even and get volunteers because they were having to cut, and let all those third grade teachers get together and do a little planning and talk about what's working, or if it's a higher grade where they switch classes and they all of a sudden learn that Mary is blossoming in music, but she isn't doing anything in science. Well, the science teacher didn't think the child could do a single thing. So we have a long ways to go in how we train and then do professional development for teachers.
Excellent. We have a tape change. This last point, a lot of people pay a lot of attention to the cognitive side of this. And if you read the interview with Dr. Whitehurst, he was pretty quick to say, we generally don't pay enough attention to the affective dimension. There's a kind of a backlash that's developed because for so long everybody was concerned with kind of artificially pumping self-esteem.
Right.
That they now got an aversion or a dismissal to that emotional side. What we're talking about is something that's much deeper than that. When shame trigger, as we know, to in the process of learning to learn to read well, we have to be self-transparent. We can be reflecting on what we're reading, but we can't be self-conscious about reading. If we're self-conscious about reading, we've got all the studies now, it shows very clearly, the brain can't be self-conscious about reading and read.
Right.
So when we talk about children becoming ashamed of reading, we're not talking about just a gross, after-the-fact feeling that they have. We're talking about something that's triggering self-consciousness in them when they're reading.
Right.
And therefore fundamentally disrupting their ability to learn to read. So it's not just an emotional, it's an unfortunate side effect. It's a fundamental cognitive issue, even at that level of the mechanics of reading.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's putting a screen between the child and the book or the print. And we just don't know enough among teachers or the people that are going to be working with those children day in, day out. Because it's such a common occurrence. It's not like once every 5 years you'll have a child in your classroom this way. Well, of course, then you would expect to use a consultant. But this is very real, and that 39% or whatever year NAEP you use on a given year, that percentage of children below basic, the vast number of them are the children that, the shame, we have to work with that before we can even, as you say, work with the skill deficiency they have. And we know there are many different ways children learn, but we can't even figure out how to do that until we can decouple that aversion to the book. And of course, this is something we work with as we work with parents, because many parents had that same problem in school, and that has carried through. They read the least amount they can to get by on the job or in their home. And an example of a story I use there is I was in a food stamp recertification class when I was working in state government. And we had gotten the people who were doing the certification for the food stamps, and these classes were to teach a little bit about nutrition, a little bit about budgeting, so that the parents could use the food stamps in a way that would maximize good health for their children and their family. So we'd gotten the instructor to interject a little bit about literacy and reading to your children and talking to your children. And my sisters say that I have a sign on my forehead, and you may not see it today, but it says, I am Lucy, the counselor is in, and that people just tell me their life stories. I can say, hello, I'm Carol Rasco, and they say, hello, I'm Sam Smith, and they tell me their latest woe or whatever. So this gentleman I was sitting next to, I had not been introduced. He knew I was not there being recertified for food stamps, but I hadn't been introduced as someone working where I did. So he just said, lady, I've got a question to ask you. And I mean, it was pretty rare, first of all, to have a male in the food stamp recertification classes, because it was usually single moms or grandmothers, but he was a single father raising several children. And he said, I've got a question to ask you. And I said, well, please do, and if I can't answer it, we'll find help. He said, why would they tell me to read to that baby? That baby can't even talk yet. And I said, well, you know, that is an interesting point. And he said, and since she can't talk, she can't answer the questions. And I said, well, that's very interesting. What kind of questions would you be talking about? And as we visited, it became very clear that for him, the only reason reading existed was to be able to answer the teacher's questions back in school after reading a passage. He had never even really made the leap that he had to do a little bit of reading to be able to get by on his, minimum wage job he had. But for him, all reading had ever been was a subject in school where you read and the teacher asked questions and you gave answers, and his answers were hardly ever right. So it was incomprehensible why you would read to a baby that couldn't even talk yet, much less maybe be able to answer the questions. And that was just, I've never forgotten that, because that is a story that we all need to understand when we're talking working early childhood. And yet it's pretty incomprehensible to all of us that would be sitting around talking about literacy that someone really felt that way and had had that experience.
It's so difficult for somebody for whom letters are transparent, literacy, that's to imagine life if they weren't.
Right.
It's like, I can't imagine being a cow, or I can't imagine being a woman, I can't imagine being a snail. It's an entirely different consciousness.
Right.
Is there anything else? I mean, this has been wonderful. Is there anything else that you think, given the scope of where we're playing in our learning and in our production here, and what's occurred to you?
I think the only other thing I would stress, but we've talked about it throughout, I haven't taught school for over 30 years, but I really do get tired of hearing teachers beat upon and beat down all the time. I don't think teacher education is up to the level it should be. And secondly, as a nation, we expect teachers to take care of this problem. I personally don't, but as a nation overall, that is the message we send. And that's wrong, because they cannot undo all of this by themselves. Many times we have not seen that they're trained to do it, nor are they given the tools once they're there to really be able to do it. So I think it's so important that we always be looking for ways to translate this into something that business people who have such a strong voice in this country can understand, that when they talk about the poor quality resumes they're getting when they advertise for a position, and the fact that they don't have people that can write anymore, we've got to make that connection for them, that it is part of the issue we're talking about this very moment. And others in the community. We really need Girl Scout and Boy Scout leaders to understand the importance of looking for ways to help language development and literacy move along there. And there are plenty of ways and instances like that. But it is a community issue. It is not just a teacher issue.
We couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we consider the primary work here as a social education project, and we mean it in that sense. We're at one section of our tape, one section of our show will be what we call the blame game, and everybody's pointing the finger. Well, it's this fault, it's this fault, it's the college, it's the teachers, it's this, it's that, it's the parents' fault. There's a deeper fundamental process going on here. There's a natural, organic human being with its cognitive and emotional powers. There's an artificial, man-made, technological, convention called this code and its relationship to this natural language process. There's so much to understand before we go on to the blame. And the more that we understand the deeper layers of this, the less anybody's on the hook for having done it wrong, because we've all been proceeding from insufficiently deeply grounded understanding. There's the fault is a propagated negligence that's been going on for hundreds of years.
Right.
It's no particular person's fault today. And,
That's right.
and one of the interesting things is the idea that school can compensate for, in a few months that it has, or a year and a half that it has, after a child begins until trouble starts to set in. And it was a very narrow window in which they're talking about having to compensate for radical variation in how well prepared children are at the point that they come in.
Right.
And without understanding that variation and the connectivity between that variation, particularly with respect to language. So we are completely in line with that.
Great.
Anything else? Corey, any questions? We covered everything that we came to cover.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.